Good morning and welcome to your Farm and Home Show. My name is Joanna Coles, and this morning we're visiting Dr. Morgan Haight. She's with the University of Kentucky, Extension Specialist there in the Biosystems and Ag Engineering. In the winter months, a lot of times we're thinking about mud and those type of things, but ventilation is an important topic to think about as well.
Yeah, a lot of people use the barns here in the winter months for protection for their animals, and it's really important to think about the air quality in those spaces. A lot of people think to themselves, I'm cold, I want to shut up my barn so that it's warmer for the animals. But animals are much more adaptable to cold temperatures than we are, and we need to remember that when we design our barns and when we ventilate them in the winter. Obviously, we still want to manage temperature in the barns similar to the summertime, but there are a couple other things we should really be thinking about, especially as we lower that ventilation rate. And one of them is relative humidity or moisture in that barn, and another is ammonia, which is pretty well tied to that moisture level. Carbon dioxide is usually a pretty good indicator gas of not enough ventilation. And dust is the other one that we will see sometimes in the wintertime. We have a pretty moist environment here. We have a lot of rainfall. So sometimes we don't see as much dust as other climates do. But if we're in a dusty space, that's also an indication we're under ventilating a barn. Opening up the barn a little bit more, creating ridge openings, either through cupolas or through what a lot of people will call like a whirligig, or just a ridge vent in general, creates a little bit of an outlet for natural ventilation to occur to allow that moist, stale air to escape with the heat from those animals.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times in the winter, especially, we kind of neglect our barns. And, with the freezing and thawing and there's moisture there, it's just one of those things that we don't consider, but we need to for sure.
Yeah, and moisture tends to be the biggest one that we're challenged with here in Kentucky. A lot of times people will say, oh, my barn is doing a really good job. And then you'll say, well, what does it do in the mornings? And they'll say it drips on me when I come in the barn in the morning, say between 7 and 10 a.m. That's an indication that there's too much moisture. You're getting a lot of condensation on surfaces, and that's more moisture than you really want. It's actually asking for bacteria growth, molds and mildews to grow, and it really deteriorates the surfaces in the barn. So if you built a barn, you have a large cost associated with that, and you don't want that barn to break down.
Absolutely. Now, would you ever recommend, if they couldn't install one of these others, to add air movement with fans? I mean, we think about that in the summer, but not in the winter.
Yeah, actually, a hybrid design, if you don't have great winter ventilation, is a great option. You can usually put in a small fan and run it either continuously or put it onto a timer so it runs for 5 minutes every hour, or 5 minutes every half hour, depending on the timer. Very common to see those on poultry barns. But those timer systems just allow a known amount of air out to get some of that moisture and staleness out of the barn. It's really interesting to see that ammonia are almost two sides of the same coin. So when we're mismanaging a barn from a manure standpoint, or we just have any manure buildup in there at all, there's a lot of nitrogen in there. So if our barn gets too wet, we get a lot of ammonia released. If the barn gets too dry and we have manure and muck on the bottom of it, we get dusty. So we're trying to find that balance where we have enough airflow through the barn to get both of those out and the right moisture content that we don't end up with ammonia or dust. And it's a fine balancing act to get them. So that humidity, dust, ammonia is a really tricky triangle for us to manage in the wintertime.
And Morgan, is that just kind of trial and error? I mean, there's not an instrument to be able to help us with that?
We have some monitoring that we can do in barns to try and figure out where those levels are. And we can do some design work to try and also do the calculations. If we're managing to keep our moisture contents design wise between like 60 and 70% relative humidity in those barns in the wintertime, we tend to have enough moisture there to not have huge dust issues. And also it's dry enough to not drive up a lot of ammonia. What we typically see is that people get those swings in the morning where that humidity gets up to 80 or 90%, and then we get that burst of ammonia that hits you when you walk in the barn. And then sometimes people will alternate that with adding something like bedding to try and dry it back out, and then it gets dusty. So honestly, getting that ventilation rate a little bit higher a lot of times resolves issues with both dust and ammonia.
If you have questions or maybe need some help because you're experiencing some of these issues in your barn in the wintertime, make sure to contact your local extension office. And we appreciate you watching the Farm and Home Show. Have a great day.